Welcome, everyone. My name is Seth Allen, and I'm the founder and one of the partners of Cadence Financial at Raymond James. Today, we are partnering with Health Code to bring you a topic on wealth. And I think I'll maybe just go to the next slide here because I think this slide and what I'm about to say correspond. Okay, a little disclaimer. Okay. Yeah, after being in this business for almost 28 years, I think the one trend that I'm seeing more is people health and their wealth are two separate things, but they're becoming more enjoined and tied to each other as we tend to live longer. And I think that when people think about wealth strategy, it's no different than their health strategy, that you got to focus on something that's going to work for you and what you're actually going to experience or live through. And the idea of this presentation today is to walk you through a number of the wealth strategies that I think are important that people need to be thinking about as they get older and they're thinking about their health and what have you at the same time. So just a little bit before we get started, and just to give you encapsulate what we're going to be talking about here. So this triangle really is a wealth triangle in terms of the things that we believe that are important for people to be addressing throughout their life. We'll be touching on each one of them to a certain degree. Obviously, some of these topics like estate and trust services or wealth transfer or tax can be a whole session in itself. So the idea here is meant to just touch base on these things from a more macro viewpoint, with the idea that if you have questions and things like that, we could always answer those after the fact. And by the way, don't worry about taking notes. We will be sending out the presentation along with the recording. So if you miss something or there's a slide that didn't quite make sense that I went through too quickly, don't worry about it. Last thing is, you can ask questions. I may not answer them to the end, depending on how much time that we have. Your questions will be anonymous. Nobody will know who's asking the question. And you can choose to be anonymous even with myself. So don't be afraid to ask a question or two. All right. Capital preservation. So everybody talks about life preservation, but I think when we hear the word capital preservation, it's not that we haven't heard about it before, but I don't think we really think about it in the context of what it means to us as an investor. And I did touch on earlier just the fact that, are two topics that are very near and dear to every one of us as we move through life. And this chart, basically what it shows is that we're all going to be living longer. We do have a certain amount of years to live as we grow older. The idea that we retire at 60 and maybe live 10 or 15 years, like our grandparents or great-grandparents may have, just isn't the case anymore. People need to start preparing to live into their 90s and even hundreds. We have clients, several of them have parents that are turning 100 and still in good health. So I think it's rather timely to be thinking about your wealth strategy and how that relates to your longevity at the same time. Okay, so just quickly, again, this isn't meant to cover every single part of the strategies you need to be thinking about for capital preservation, but the idea is to try to grab some of the big topics here. So the first thing is looking at diversification. A lot of times people will kind of go all in on a certain sector or a certain asset type just because it's performed well recently, or they think that's the one that's going to make them all their return. I can't emphasize enough the importance of having different asset classes during different market cycles. We're experiencing some of that right here in Vancouver with our real estate. It was a great asset class for a number of years, and right now it seems to be in question as to which direction it's going to go. Fixed income, I call it the boring asset that nobody wants to talk about until you see a market correction. Again, it's boring, but stable returns, high quality dividend paying stocks. So it's exciting to own a NVIDIA or something even further down the food chain like a Peloton. And if you're lucky, you buy at low prices and these things get a life of their own and have a big run. But the reality is having a good portfolio of dividend payers and consistent dividend payers definitely helps that wealth preservation continue. Having cash. So this is another thing too. A lot of times people don't put enough cash on the sidelines. Things come up all the time. It could be little things like your roof is leaking and you need to get a new roof, to a medical diagnosis that requires you to travel to the States to get an operation. Again, I think that people should have at least 6 months worth of cash on the sidelines just in case. And the other reason for this is so you don't have to sell assets, whether it be real estate, stocks, at times when it doesn't make sense to do that. Cross-border structures, I think people are going to be hearing more about this as time goes on. As we deal with the effects of inflation, and particularly right now where we don't know if inflation is going to take off again or not, I think you need to be looking outside of Canada when it comes to some hedges for that kind of thing, and also with the political risk side of things too. Alternative investments, of course, things such as structured notes, where you get some downside protection with an income stream, is obviously helpful in commodities. And again, there's lots of other investment classes, but again, I think the message here is diversification. That's a starting point. I think that as you build your wealth and you start thinking about your kids and grandkids and your company and your shareholders and other stakeholders and things like that, I mean, you need to start to look at trusts and various multi-generational structures. Doing things like estate freezes and tax deferrals are obviously beneficial. And again, it's not a one size fits all. It's something that you need to kind of, it's like, again, on the health side, not everybody necessarily needs to do the same things to keep a certain level of health. Each one of us are unique individuals and we have different metabolisms and things like that. So no different than when it comes to managing your wealth and looking at some of these more advanced strategies. Philanthropy, that's a big one, particularly in Vancouver here. I think we're a very generous city when it comes to supporting worthy causes, whether it be Children's Hospital or the food bank and things like that. But I think that, again, as the wealth grows, there's some efficient and creative ways on how you can structure that giving. And there was a gentleman, and I don't remember his name, unfortunately, but he wrote a book that you don't need to be dead to leave a legacy. I think in the past, there's this idea that you waited till you were 6 feet under and pushing up daisies to have a statue of you somewhere, giving all your money away. I think now you can do a lot of this actively as you go through your life. So, okay, portfolio architecture. So capital preservation is great, but how you build these things is just as important. And I think the other point here is that the market, the investments themselves really don't care about you. What matters is you focusing on the outcomes that work for yourself and obviously align with your lifestyle. So one of the things I think is often overlooked, it kind of gets talked about at different times. And I know that some people's eyes might gloss over. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not here to preach to anybody, but I'm here to make some very pointed and candid observations. We all suffer from psychological biases. They're hardwired. You can't eliminate them no matter what you do. All you can do is just be aware of them. And when you're aware of them, look to make better decisions. There's a number of the biases that exist. And if anybody's really into this, you can read a book called Think Fast, Think Slow by Daniel Kahneman, where he and his associates highlight a lot of the research behind it. But as you can see from some of these ones, the rule of thumb bias, making decisions based on past rules of thumb that may or may not be valid in today's world. Anchoring bias, you had some experience in the past or you saw your portfolio do a certain amount last year, and that's now the new base for where everything should be judged off of. Snake bite effect, I think that one's obvious. Some people are terrified of investing in the stock market because they had a bad experience at some point in their life. Again, these things are normal to have. It's just being aware of them and trying to bring more rational thinking to your investment decisions is what's going to help you. The other big one here is predicting versus forecasting. So pretty much everything you see on the news and the papers, on CNBC, that's all predictions. Predictions are great, but it's like trying to predict Vancouver weather day to day. They're very difficult at best at times and quite often could lead to bad outcomes. Forecasting is a little bit different. I reference Bayes' theorem. I'm not going to get into it, but if you Google it, it kind of explains how that works. But we naturally do this kind of thing every day when it comes to forecasting. Somehow I managed to get out of bed this morning and figure out I didn't need snow boots and I didn't need snow tires to get to work. I brought a rain jacket and an umbrella in case it rained. It's the same thing when it comes to how you make your decisions when it comes to the investment side and the architecture of a portfolio. I think this picture also speaks 1,000 words. I don't really need to say much. We're all guilty of it, folks. that herd investing mentality. We saw it during 2000 .coms, maybe saw it in Vancouver real estate over the last bit. Definitely saw it when it came to the Mag 7 tech stocks. It's not necessarily that you're always going to end up with the crocodiles, but if you're running with a herd, you better be careful. So I mentioned outcomes and investments. I think that, again, if you want to be successful and put together a good portfolio and build, and not only build that wealth, but maintain it and transfer it properly, you need to figure out the outcome that you need, not the outcome the market needs, not the outcome that your neighbor needs. It's the outcome that you need. And there's really three parts to that is like, what's your mission, right? What's the outcome you're trying to achieve? How are you going to line up the investment strategy and to get there? And the next part is, what does the investment management look like? It's very simple, but unfortunately, I think a lot of us overlook that when it comes to, again, managing our wealth and trying to figure out how to make it go last as long as we're going to be around, particularly, again, if we're getting into our 90s or 100s. So part of the investment strategy is having a plan, right? You don't really go on a road trip without having some idea where you're going. The other thing too is I think sometimes people get confused between what's a financial projection and what's a financial plan. I guess the best way to think about it is a plan is a blueprint, a financial projection is a reality check. So reality checks are great because we can sometimes fantasize about things that we want to do with our money as we go through life. And then there's a reality check to it. I think at the same time, it's good to have an overall blueprint that goes a little bit deeper and really projects out where you need to be heading in the outcomes to ensure those outcomes are achieved. And again, very similar documents, but really two different objectives are trying to be achieved there. And by the way, you don't necessarily need to have both of them. Sometimes it makes sense just to have financial projections done, or vice versa with a financial plan. I threw this in here hesitantly because I think the starting point for anybody's portfolio needed to fund retirement is really different. And I'll get into this a little bit. One has to do with risk tolerance and risk capacity. The other has to do with, frankly, how much risk do you need to take to get that outcome. But this is generally an asset allocation that I think is relevant for most people. As you can see, there's an allocation to fixed income, the boring old stuff that we all don't like to talk about unless there's a big market correction. Equities. I've highlighted North American equities because the reality is the US market makes up 70% of the global market. And sure, you can go invest in Japan and Switzerland and UK and stuff, but I would argue that most of what you can get for diversification and on a risk reward basis is really here in North America. Obviously having cash and then alternatives, which can range anything from gold to structured notes to other types of assets that are really uncorrelated with fixed income and equities. Okay, so remember I talked about it depends on that asset allocation and what have you. I think you got to look at tax and risk, and particularly the impact it has long term. And there's this idea of risk tolerance and capacity to take risks. So for any of you that remember that book, The Secret Life of Walter Smitty, I think maybe at times we all want to be that Wall Street maven or Wall Street lion that can pick the bottoms and sell the tops and use margin and swing for the fences, as they say. But the reality is most of us don't have that capacity to take that kind of risk. And I would also put forth that the management of risk is much more important than management of returns. By the way, that's not a new idea. That's something that came from a gentleman named Benjamin Graham, who Warren Buffett considered as his mentor and studied under. And again, I think it's the capacity to take risks that one needs to think about a lot more than their actual willingness to take risk. I've broken this up into three buckets here, talking about risk and how to think about it. So what do I mean by capacity? Things like time horizon, your current liquidity constraints. So again, it might be a thing where you have a PhD in economics and you understand the market completely, but You may be starting out early in life and you have 3 kids and you're paying off a student loan and you just don't have the money to put in the market at the moment because you need the liquidity, right? Or the flip end of it is you could be equivalent to Bill Gates and you can invest in a GIC that even after tax and inflation that you're losing money, you're still going to have enough to get to the outcomes you need. I think the biggest risk is on the right-hand side is not focusing on the outcomes you need, lifestyle, legacy, and frankly, emotional stress, right? I think it's okay to acknowledge that not all of us are going to be a Wall Street maven or a Wall Street line investor. In fact, many of those ones that are, it doesn't end too well for them. They tend to be the risk seeker. I call it the Vegas investor. Most people are risk averse, i.e., rational. I know that word, the connotation of it makes people think avoid risk. No, it actually just means that you're willing to take a certain amount of risk to get a reasonable rate of return. And most people, we settle in the middle there. And for most people, that does get them the financial outcomes that they need, along with managing that capacity to take risk. Okay, tax considerations. So I'm not an accountant. This is general advice. We work with really good accountants and tax lawyers that help assist clients with the specific execution of their tax strategies. But I think it's good to go over some of these topics because, I call it like the doctor that tells you not to smoke and goes around the corner and smokes a pack of cigarettes. You would be surprised at how many professionals that are involved in tax that don't even follow these basic tax considerations. So if they're not doing it, maybe you're not doing it either yourself or not having it fully executed properly. So one of the things is I call it order of capital use. So it's figuring out the most tax efficient way to spend your money, right? Whether you take it out of registered accounts first or not, whether you draw down RSP or a RIF sooner than later, whether you take money from a TFSA. Again, I think it's not enough thought is put into that. Timing of losses and that management of it. Again, sometimes people forget that December 31st for most of us is tax year end. And sometimes it makes sense to capitalize on some losses if you've had a lot of gains during the year. But there's a way to manage that so that you also don't kind of lose the other outcome you're looking for, and that's to maximize your returns. Sometimes people are a little bit too quick to take a win, but not quick enough to take a loss. And again, that can obviously have impact on how your investment outcomes look. Income splitting, you can still do some of it. The government has taken away a lot of those things over the years that were quite beneficial decades ago. That being said, there's still ways to be doing it, but you obviously want to make sure you don't fall afoul of the Tax Act. Corporate tax deferrals, CDA accounts, I'm sure anybody that has a corporation, you know about those, but also understanding when it makes sense to keep more money in the corporate account versus taking out where you're ultimately going to pay the final tax, or hopefully the final tax. And then these two abbreviations, my associate that helped with this presentation, I know what they are, but I always get them garbled up as to the acronym. The LCGE is Lifetime Capital Gains Exemption, and the QSBC is the Qualified Business Corporation. I actually wrote that down in front of me, so I didn't get my tongue tied on that. But again, this is something that makes a big difference when it comes to if you're selling a business, particularly if you have a small business and what have you, or you're looking to do some kind of tax strategy to pass the business on to the next generation or to your employees. Again, there's some sound tax strategy around that can save you a lot of money. Oh yeah, and asset location optimization. I think again, one needs to think about how your assets are held, where they're held. I'll give you an example. If you had assets in Dubai right now, I'm hearing that they're now restricting people from taking out more than $100,000. So you don't want to be in a situation or in a location or geography where something could change for reasons you don't control that would obviously impede your investments, or worse, cause a tax issue, which again, we've seen a lot of these things happen, particularly over the last few years, where governments come out with some rather onerous tax policy. All right, my mouth went dry talking about tax. Cross-border wealth management considerations for globally held assets. What does that mean? So more and more, and I'm sure some of you on this call have family, relatives, definitely people that live in other countries or provinces. When I started the business, nobody was really talking about this kind of stuff, but it's becoming a much, much bigger issue where somebody starts a business here in Vancouver, let's say. The kids decide to go to school in the States, they meet that special somebody, they get married, and maybe the kids are the executor of the estate down there. And all of a sudden, you're now setting yourself up for a massive tax issue, having a foreign executor, let alone one in the States that's going to inherit money, creates all sorts of situations, or vice versa. You have assets in the States, it could be apartment buildings, it could be real estate, and you haven't had somebody go through and properly look at how to set it up in a way that doesn't trigger a nasty tax exposure. I also talk about interprovincial because I think from province to province, it also makes a pretty big difference when it comes to things like executors, power of attorneys. Quebec has very different rules and laws than British Columbia, for example. It also makes a difference when it comes to probate fees and how those work. And I think, again, touching on international mobility beyond the US and the other provinces of Canada, more clients are moving to Europe and perhaps South America and other places. Again, if you ever plan to come back, you want to make sure that you're doing things properly. And these exit taxes can be complicated, but they're not something you should ignore. They're something you should deal with and address properly, but you can do that efficiently. And again, sometimes people get tripped up not realizing these things exist. And again, when I say this, I've seen the most sophisticated people get tripped up on US estate tax exposure just with something simple like they have their son or daughter is one of the co-executors of an estate who live in the US, as an example. I think this is one definitely where you want to work with a team of advisors. The reality is think of it like on the health side, you may have your general practitioner, but if you need heart surgery or you need foot surgery, that's a specific professional. I think when it comes to cross-border tax, definitively, you definitely need to have a few different people on your team working with you. Okay, this is the fun one. How to structure assets for protection and effective intergenerational wealth transfer. This is a massive topic. I'm only going to touch on, I think, some things that I'm seeing a lot these days, whether it be somebody with a corporation or somebody that's in a second marriage, or there's some issues with kids or grandchildren. Before I kind of get into it, I'm going to just say two things. One is I've seen this handled two different ways by clients over the years. There's ones that obsess on what to do with their wills and their trusts and stuff until the day they die, hoping that somehow they'll ultimately control everything that could go wrong of giving money to their relatives or loved ones. And then I've seen other people who just take a measured approach. They put a certain amount of time and energy into doing it. They have good communication with the beneficiaries and the stakeholders, laying out what's going to happen when, say, mom or dad pass on, and realize that, yeah, some things can go wrong and some unintended things can happen, but they're not going to waste a lot of angst and stress trying to micromanage every possible thing that could happen. I think we've seen shows like Succession, for example, where you see the one side of that. Again, I think that good communication is one of the things that helps avoid a lot of this problem down the road. On that note, good communications, having proper shareholder agreements in place, whether it be a mandatory sale of the shares or set up to prevent a third party from coming into the family business without the key shareholders, the family members, agreeing to it. On the family trust and estate side, again, doing estate freezes makes sense, and not in all cases, but in some, definitely. Setting up a family trust of some sort as well helps avoid probate, helps protect things from if there is a marital breakdown, particularly if it's a second marriage. And again, you can do all this. For those that like to control things, you can still retain control in a lot of cases until you pass on. A couple of the trusts that I think are pretty popular these days are alter ego and joint partner trusts. The nice thing is you still control the property. There's no tax issues up front. It's alter ego is exactly how it sounds. It's a alter ego of yourself. And the reason why these are good is that it helps with things that inevitably are going to happen, like incapacity at some point. If we're all living longer into our 90s and hundreds, at some point maybe we're not able to make decisions the same way we were able to before. Having a trust set up allows some ability to have co-trustees and things like that. It also keeps people's eyes off the will. You think about the old days when somebody passed on, they were called to the estate or manor, and the lawyer read out the will to the whole family, and some people passed out, other people celebrated, and then everybody started fighting. By having a trust set up, you basically avoid all that. And you also avoid the potential to have the will varied. And what that means, particularly in BC, is whatever your wishes are could end up in court and being fought over by various stakeholders. And of course, the probate fees you avoid. Thing to keep in mind for any, and I'm sure that some of you that have these know this, there is a cost to maintain them. You got to file a tax return. They cost at least 10 to 20 grand to set up. Sometimes more, depends on the complication. So again, I think this is something that can be quite efficient for people that are looking to do something a little bit more than nothing, but don't want to have the stress of too much of a complicated structures. Okay, I'm going to come back to bottom line. I just want to show everybody in the appendix here. I got a lot more here on risk management. I'm not going to go over this. You'll get it when we send these slides. Intergenerational wealth transfer. Some more points on this, on having dual wills, holdco, opco separation, estate freezes. So as you can see, there's quite a bit more to all this than just what I went through in this presentation. I think that, again, people tend to have a team, particularly at Health Code, a team of health professionals helping them to live longer. I am a firm believer that you need to have a team of wealth professionals to help that money live as long as you live. So just recap here. Yeah, we're all longevity. We're all living longer. We need to build portfolios and wealth strategies to sustain that wealth through longer lives. Diversification. Again, it's such a general word, but it's such a misunderstood or misapplied application. I can't stress enough how important that is. Making plans, whether it be projections or a financial plan, you want it data driven. It will be based on numbers and logic, not on your emotions or your gut feelings. This really helps. You wouldn't build a house without architectural plans. Why would you have your wealth not have a proper plan? Smart tax and risk management. I chuckle only because every year I ask my accountant the same question: how do I save more money on taxes? I think the smart part of this is really doing a proper tax audit of what you're doing, not a Revenue Canada audit, but a proper tax and risk management audit that really looks at your overall wealth situation and looks for the blind spots, right? There'll be the obvious ones. You might have too much real estate, or you don't have enough in equities or dividend stocks. But I suspect that if you humbly put yourself forward for a tax and risk management audit of your overall wealth, I think that it will really help you see some blind spots that could be easy, might be a little bit tricky to clean up, but at least you're aware of them. Cross-border, can't stress this enough. Things like power of attorneys that exist here in BC aren't necessarily valid in Florida. So people that travel, or they have family or relatives that live across different jurisdictions that are involved in your wealth, or can be recipients of your wealth, I can't stress enough the importance of having cross-border coordination of investment professionals, whether it be tax, legal, finance, making sure things all kind of jive the way they should. And that really kind of carries up to the tax and risk management side. Family trust and shareholder agreements. Again, I think what this does is makes it very clean and smooth for transitions. I think as well, to the degree that you want to share it with your family members or other people that are going to be a beneficiary of your estate, I think making sure you communicate and being open about these things really helps head off any kind of future problems, or a lot of them, in my opinion. At least nobody will be surprised if mom or dad decide not to leave anything to one of their children. Everything's been put in a trust, and there might be reasons for it. And I guess the last point I'll just say, and again, I put the plug on this is, look, again, healthco is an example. Like if you got a team of health professionals that you trust to help you live longer, then why don't you have a team of financial professionals to help manage that wealth? And again, whether it be tax, whether it be legal, whether it be investment, and just like on the health side to some degree, they don't all have to be with the same company. In fact, it can be different companies. But I think you really need to think of your wealth the same way you think of your health. So on that note, like I said, we'll send you out the presentation. I didn't look to see if we had any questions. I'm just trying to be cognizant of time here. Okay, whoops. Hang on. Anybody have any questions at all? Okay, I hope I didn't go through this stuff too quickly. I do see about 4 or 5 questions. They're a little bit more personal and of a specific nature. I'm going to hold off on answering them. They have to do around trusts and beneficiaries. Here's a good one. I didn't get into insurance a whole lot. Asking about, I think it's the whole life insurance policies. If I'm correct with the question, yeah, insurance is a great strategy as part of your overall wealth strategy. I think the careful thing you need to ask is, oh yeah, okay, participate in whole life. Yeah, I think I have one. Look, when it comes to insurance, we know why we buy car insurance and house insurance. I think that if you're going to do anything when it comes to life insurance, particularly whole life or universal life or term, you really need to answer for yourself, what is it you're insuring for? I think sometimes we get talked into some of these policies and they sound really great and what have you, but then we forget, why did we do it in the first place? I know why I did. I have a lovely little baby girl who was recently born, and I want to make sure if something happens to me that both my wife and my daughter are well looked after, right? That's the only reason I'm doing it. Yeah, that's right. I've just seen a couple comments pop up here. So yeah, so getting back to the insurance thing, I think that when I say do a bit of an audit on yourself when it comes to tax and when it comes to some of the risks you're taking your assets, you should also do an insurance audit because again, we understand very simply why we buy car insurance. From my experience, it's not always clear why people buy life insurance. And again, there's absolutely great reasons to do it. There's reasons with corporations and tax savings. There's reasons like in my case that I want to make sure my daughter's more than well looked after. But there's some other reasons that tend to come up that I kind of question whether it actually made sense for the person to do it or not. So again, this is why having a team of professionals, if you had an accountant or something like that could review it for you, maybe or maybe not, you wouldn't do the policy the same way. Other questions here? Okay. Still got about a minute or two left, I think, in this. Somebody was asking clarification what I meant about audit. What I'm really basically saying is it's kind of like when you go in for a health check and you get your heart checked and you run on the machine and you breathe in that thing. And I'm so sorry, I'm going to get the terminology wrong. It's that thing to check out your cardio and your recovery from racing your heart up to 190 or something like that. You know, getting your blood test, checking your vitamins. It's the same idea when it comes to your various wealth. And if you remember back earlier in the presentation, I had that triangle there. That really encapsulates pretty much everybody's wealth or different parts of wealth that somebody might have exposure to. All you need to do is humbly look at yourself or have somebody help you look at it or a team of professionals look at it and see if it makes sense and see if it connects to the other parts. So does your insurance strategy match up with your investment strategy? And does your investment strategy match up with your real estate strategy and your international family that lives all over the world? Does that match up with your estate strategy? And really, where are the blind spots and where are the things that you can fix reasonably, right? I think that, again, people don't want to think about it because it takes a little bit of time and brain power. And as the folks at Health Code talk about is brain elasticity and exercising it works. So think of it this way, you're actually going to live longer by thinking about your wealth a little bit more diligently. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up unless there's any other questions coming through right now. Okay, well, thank you, folks. I really appreciate you all coming out for this. And if there's any questions that you had, you were too afraid to ask, or you just want to email in, you can send it off to the lady on my team who will be sending out the copy of the presentation. thanks a lot. I really appreciate everybody's time, and looks like we might get a little bit of sunshine coming on. I'm just looking outside right now. So if you live in White Rock, you might be experiencing sun while we still have a few clouds. Anyways, thanks again, folks, and that's all.